Hello, welcome to American Government. Today we're talking about Chapter 17, which deals with domestic policy making. One thing to think about here, how is policy made? I would argue that there's a four-step process to making policy, and this is something that applies to domestic policy, foreign policy. It can even apply to decisions in your own life if you want to think of it this way. First of all, is that what you do is you start up here at the upper right-hand corner here, you define the problem. What is the problem? Right? You want to come up with a way of dealing with things, but what is the problem you need to deal with? Is it something like repaving highways? Is it rebuilding infrastructure? Is it dealing with healthcare? Is it how to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic? Whatever it might be. It can be anything like, how do I deal with my homework? How do I prepare for my major? How do I decide what classes to take in the spring? You define your problem. Second stage of this is create a policy. That is, what are you going to do about the problem? If it's the COVID-19 pandemic, what are you going to do? You're going to focus on healthcare innovations. You're going to focus on developing a vaccine. You're going to develop treatments for it. You're going to focus on prevention, whatever kinds of things. So you create your policy. Third step is you implement the policy. That is, you put the policy actually into effect. And this is done by, in domestic policy we're talking about here, by the US government, state governments, local governments. Fourth thing is you evaluate the policy. Is it actually working? Is it doing what it's supposed to do? Does it have unintended consequences? Does it have side effects? Is it creating other kinds of problems, or is it working well? And so what policymakers then do is they evaluate the process, they evaluate the outcome of the process, and then they go back again and start all over again. So you look at the process, what worked, what didn't work, then you define what needs to be done additionally. Define the policy, create the policy. How do you deal with the problems that the first policy didn't deal with? Then you implement that policy, then you evaluate that policy. Okay, so that four-stage policy-making process, like arms of a clock going around here. Okay, defining the problem. There's this four-step process here. First of all, we got to frame the problem. That is, you got to think about what is the problem. Is this a problem that can be dealt with? Is it something that a policy can deal with? Is that be at the federal level, state level, the local level? Second thing is you look at the evidence about this. What is the problem here? Is this really what's going on here? So for instance, something like there's been an increase in violent crime over the last couple of years. Is that because of what? Is it because of the pandemic? Is it because people were kept at home? Is it because people were using medicine that was causing them to behave strangely? Was it frustration, their inability to control their own destiny? Whatever kinds of things, right? So what's the evidence that this is the problem that you're thinking it is, and it's not some other kind of problem going on here? Second, finally, there you think about the risks of the policy. That is, what are the risks of doing nothing versus what are the risks of creating a policy? If you develop a policy, you create a risk of spending money. You create a risk of having people disagree with the policy. You have a risk of people getting into conflict because of this. And so there's a thing called SWOT analysis: strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats is what that stands for. This is something that people who make policy do a lot of. They evaluate the strengths. That is, if you've got a policy to deal with the pandemic, we'll say, what are the strengths of the US government? It's got a lot of resources it can mobilize. You got the CDC, the FDA. It can use the war powers that it has to get companies to spend their time and resources on creating vaccines or cures for the COVID-19 virus. The weaknesses, well, maybe the federal government is too high of a level. Maybe it needs to be more local or county level or state level things that deal with it. Opportunities, this is a chance to maybe build a new way of dealing with pandemics. One assumption is that we're going to have more and more of these kinds of pandemics happening going forward in the future. Threats, what are the threats to the government of doing something? What are the international threats? What are the local threats, the national level threats, those kind of things. Second thing, take the steps to address the problem. That is, develop the policy. Okay, how do you balance questions like equity? How do you develop a policy that applies to everybody the same way, that benefits people the same way, benefits all people regardless of their class, their location, urban or rural, their politics, whatever it might be, versus how do you develop a policy that doesn't curtail people's freedom? So for instance, fighting the virus, telling people to wear masks, telling people to stay home, closing down bars and restaurants, things like that. These all curtailed freedom. And so those need to be addressed in the policy. Is that what's necessary to actually deal with this virus, as opposed to something other kind of approach here? Other kinds of things here: security, efficiency, accountability, affordability. Coming up with a policy that has everybody stay at home during the pandemic means that you got people who don't have an income now. Is the state going to pay them a salary? Does the US have enough money to give payments to people basically to keep them at home? Who's going to pay for all this stuff later on? Who's accountable for these kind of things? So yes, the US government did pass stimulus packages over the past couple of years that gave people money, particularly lower income people, to basically stay home because they weren't working. And so extended unemployment benefits, they gave other kinds of money to people to help them out in this situation. Well, now that the bills for those were going to come for payment eventually. Third thing is the implementation of policy. One of the things they say about policy is that policymakers are always trying to solve yesterday's problems. That is, they're reactive to things. They're not proactive. And so the US government has spent the last couple of years reacting to the COVID-19 pandemic. How much of a policy does it have for dealing with another pandemic? What if there's another kind of a virus that comes along, something that we may have know about or don't even know about, that now follows this, that may be connected to it or may be completely unrelated to it? How proactive are we being in dealing with that? Excuse me, as opposed to reactive. Okay. Fourth thing is about the evaluations. What are your standards for evaluating things, right? Do you want to have a policy that is 100% effective, 75% effective, 50% effective, 10% effective? What is the baseline for deciding whether a policy has succeeded? And how is that measured? I.e., are you measuring it in terms of the control of people getting infected by the virus, or the people getting killed by the virus, or people in the hospital but survive, et cetera, et cetera? And so the evaluation is determined by deciding on what are the standards that you're using to do it, and then monitoring it. That is, how do you know? How do you get the information about whether the policy has worked? Who do you talk to? What are your measures? Do you count the number of people who've been in hospitals from day to day? How do you know the counts are accurate, that people are being counted who are there because of COVID and not just in the hospital because of something else? Or people who go into the hospital for something else, but then get COVID while they're in the hospital, and those kind of things. And so evaluation is a tricky business because you've got to basically know what you're evaluating in order to know if the policy has really worked. Okay, the book talks about the types of politics here. This is something I hadn't really gone into before, but he talked about in a few chapters here. There's 4 types of politics: majoritarian, entrepreneurial, client, and interest group. The way I've done here is I've just built a chart here. On the right, on the left here, you got perceived benefits. That is, who benefits from the policy, versus perceived costs. That is, who's perceived, at least, to be paying for this, and who does pay for it. And then you get the question of whether those things are distributed, whether the costs are distributed widely, like, say, paid for by the taxpayers, or are they concentrated? Is it certain groups of people who pay the cost, users of something, or the wealthy that pay the most taxes, or something like that? Well, they don't pay the most taxes, but anyway. Perceived benefits also, are they distributed? Does everybody benefit from policy, or most of the people, or do very few people benefit from that policy? So think about something like the politics of, let's say, politics of the US government getting involved in making a vaccine. Okay, so the US government went to drug companies and it asked them to make a vaccine very fast as they could. And it had to be tested, it had to be safe, it had to be proven to be effective and safe before it could be used on people. But they wanted it to be done very quickly. Generally, the standard for most pharmaceutical companies to develop and get some new drug to market is a matter of years, because they develop it, they test it, they do trials, they do human trials, they do animal trials oftentimes before they do human trials, and then they have to go through a lengthy approval process. That was sped up in the case of the coronavirus vaccine by Pfizer, Moderna, Johnson & Johnson, other companies that were involved in that. So think about this then. So who's going to benefit from these vaccines? Well, this would be something that presumably would be distributed, was their thinking. Everybody would benefit from the vaccine. Who would pay for this? Taxpayers would pay for this. And so this is a majoritarian type of politics here, that tax money, taxes are paid by everybody, everybody gets the benefit. On the other hand, think of something like a private airport. If the town of Delhi wants to build a private airstrip for wealthy people to land their private airplanes on, then you've got a thing where the benefits of that airport are going to be concentrated. Very concentrated. They're going to be concentrated basically to people who own airplanes or use private airplanes that would land at this airstrip. That means most of the population of Delhi would not be using it, and so they would not be collecting the benefits. Well, if that airport is to be paid for by taxes in Delaware County and Delhi, then they've actually distributed the costs, but concentrated the benefits. So we have a client politics here. That is, few people benefit, but everybody pays. On the other hand, if you've got, say, the few benefiting from this private airport have to pay for that private airport by some surcharge on their using it, or user fees, but no tax money goes into it, then you've got something called interest group politics here, where the perceived costs are concentrated, the perceived benefits are concentrated. If you've got something where the perceived benefits are distributed, but the perceived costs are concentrated, then you've got something that's called entrepreneurial politics. That is, say, something like a wealth tax on billionaires. The cost of a wealth tax on billionaires would be highly concentrated. Since there aren't very many billionaires, they would be the ones paying for it. Millionaires and other people who are not even millionaires would not be paying the perceived costs of this, but they might be getting the benefits. And so the costs would be concentrated to few, the benefits would be spread out over many. And so you have entrepreneurial politics. So that's the basic way that notion works here, is when you think about policy, domestic policy in particular here, think about who it is that's paying for it. Is it paid for by taxpayer money? Is it paid by users? Is it somehow the benefits, are they spread out so everybody gets a benefit? Say Social Security, distributed benefits of retirement money paid for by everybody who works and pays Social Security taxes. Something like aid to families of dependent children, this was paid for by taxes, distributed, but relatively few people get that aid because relatively few people needed that aid. And so that was a kind of client politics here, where the perceived costs are wide, but the benefits aren't so wide. All right. Also think about history, because history matters when it comes to making policies. I mentioned before, there's this notion of policymakers make policy for yesterday, not tomorrow. And so it's important to think about when you think about American domestic policy, think about what are the precedents. Anything that is being considered now, for instance, Joe Biden's Build Back Better program. Where did it come from? Where do you get the ideas for these programs? Why do it this way? Why not do it another way? Well, part of it's because is confined by his understanding of history to come up with policies. Remember that four-step process here is thinking about the problem. What's the problem? America needs to be built back better. That is, we need to have more spending on healthcare. We need more spending on infrastructure. We need more protection for people who are living in poverty or near poverty. We need to be spending more money on education. These are all kinds of things that are part of that program. And so he's identified a need here. Now they come up with a policy, this Build Back Better program. Well, problem is now they need the money for it. And that's where Congress comes in. The House of Representatives just passed, approved the program the other day, Friday, I think it was. The Senate now needs to take it up. Will it pass the Senate? Unclear. There are a lot of people in the Senate who don't really like this program. A lot of Democrats who don't like it. And so it's going to be a real struggle for the Democrats to get the majority to vote in favor of this program. They may succeed, they may not. But the historical context of these programs are things like the New Deal, the Great Society program of Lyndon Johnson back in the 60s, as opposed to, say, something like Make America Great Again programs of Donald Trump, which are more recent, which focused on tax cuts for the wealthy, not on building infrastructure, dealing with poverty, hunger, education, any of those kinds of problems. Politics tends to be reactive, not proactive. Our elected officials don't tend to say, we need to do this for the next 10, 20 years, and voters don't seem to care about what's going to happen in the next 10, 20, 30 years. When it comes to American voters, they want immediate gratification, and they vote for people they think is going to help them immediately. Americans aren't really willing to sacrifice, and I'm sorry to say this, but I'm assuming that most of you are in, say, college age, in your 20s or so. Your age group doesn't vote very much in elections. Older people vote. People over 60 are the ones that vote most highly in elections. But what are they voting for? They're not voting for the future. They're voting for right now. They're voting to protect their Social Security benefits, their Medicare. They're voting to make you pay for their benefits that they'll be using over the next few years. Okay, so keep in mind that there are things that are possible. There are things that are just not possible in the United States. That is, there are things that just don't happen, right? During the New Deal in the 1930s, Franklin Roosevelt wanted to propose creating a national healthcare system, a national single-payer healthcare system where the government would take over the healthcare system. That seemed to be too controversial. And so he decided, well, he'd get what he could done with the New Deal, but that meant sacrificing that part of it. Even Donald Trump's Make America Great program had to recognize that there were certain programs that exist that people weren't going to let be on the chopping block. There were things that could not be done by him or anybody else in order to undo the New Deal or the Great Society programs. Also, remember that in American politics, you've got lots of things involved in it. You don't just have the president and Congress. You've got think tanks, you've got advisors, you've got the political parties, the media, the voters. They're all involved in this, in making a policy. They all have differing views on what they want, what the problems are, and how to deal with those kinds of things. And so policy making is always a process of balancing those constraints, balancing the budget constraints, balancing competing interests. There's a notion of guns and butter as part of American politics, guns being spending on the defense and the Department of Defense versus butter, which is spending on social programs, health, education, and welfare programs. And they are seen to be competitive with each other, not complementary. You either get one or the other, and different presidents support one or the other. Some presidents support more spending on the military, think Ronald Reagan, some others want to spend more on domestic affairs, think Joe Biden. And so they have to somehow balance those competing interests, those competing needs of the budget. Okay, couple of things here you can take a look at. These are links from the Guardian and other things about the making of American policy during the age of the COVID-19. That is last year and during the last, well, since February 2020, we'll say. Now, one of the starting assumptions here was about what's called the R0 number, R0 or naught. What this means is that when you think about disease, they think about how many people can one person infect. And that's the R0 number. Early in when the coronavirus first came out and people didn't know about it, one person could infect up to probably about 8 or 9 other people. And that means those 8 people will all infect another 8 people. So one person starts with it, then you got 8, then you got 64, et cetera, et cetera. And it's spread around the world like that. Well, eventually the R naught number starts to go down as we become aware of the virus and become aware of masking, of social distancing, and eventually you get the vaccine, which cuts the R naught number down. Well, the virus will continue to spread as long as that R number is above 1. So if one person can affect one other person, that means it will spread one person at a time. But if it drops below 1, then it means that one person is not infecting anybody anymore. And then it goes away. But as long as you have an R naught of, say, 2 or 3, that means that every person who gets the disease is going to infect another 2 or 3 people with it. And that it will continues to make sure that the virus will continue to spread, and it will continue to evolve over time. And so we get eventually the Delta variant, which we dealt with last spring, last fall and spring, which is even more deadly and more spreading, spread faster, and was more deadly, made more people sick faster than any of the other ones. Well, in the case of the United States and most countries around the world, when the virus hit, they didn't know what to do. And you may remember that the CDC was giving contradictory advice sometimes. Initially, in March of 2020, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention were saying, don't wear masks. There's no need to wear masks. Some people then just ignored that and started wearing masks. Others didn't wear masks and got sick. They talked about social distancing, and the social distancing rules changed as well. And so it was 10 feet for a while, then it was 6 feet for a while, and it got stuck at 6 feet. And then the question was, well, is 6 feet enough? And it's discovered that people sitting in restaurants could be sitting 20 feet away and still get the virus because it was being carried through the air conditioning system. And so that meant that, well, it wasn't safe to go to restaurants or bars because you didn't have to be close to anybody and still get it because the air wasn't circulating enough. And so that meant we then had to go into stay-at-home orders or quarantines, things like that, and as an attempt to deal with this. And so all of these were part of the policy-making process, all based on what I've talked about there, those considerations of resources, responsibilities, desired effect, wanted to know what was happening. Maybe the CDC said, don't wear masks, not because they didn't think they were good, but because they thought that would lead to a shortage of masks for healthcare professionals. Maybe once that shortage was gotten over, then they started saying everybody can wear masks now. Okay. Policy is a contest. That's what politics is all about. Politics is about getting into office so that you can make policy, that your party can make policy, that your group can make policy, and you can continue to make policy. That's what politics is about, making policy. And so keep in mind that the government is coming up with policies during the Trump administration and now during the Biden administration. They were coming up with policies, and those policies weren't necessarily being accepted. And so one thing that was going on was the CDC was issuing guidelines, not policies, but guidelines, and certain governors around the country were just ignoring them or refusing to implement them, saying that we won't do quarantines, we won't shut down restaurants or bars here, we won't force people to wear masks, we won't force people to get vaccines, various things like that. And so there's the question about whether these policies were violating our civil liberties. Well, let me address that very quickly here. No, the answer to that question is no. Civil liberties, as defined by the Supreme Court through numerous cases over the last couple of hundred years, mean that you have the right to do anything you want until you harm somebody else. That is, you have the right to free speech, but if you engage in speech that is harmful to somebody else, hate speech, lies, slander, libel, you don't have the right to do that. your civil liberties only extend so far as harming another person. That is the principle of harm that the courts use when they decide whether a person is exercising their civil liberties or not. Oliver Wendell Holmes expressed this in the 1919 case, Schenck versus the US, as saying that Schenck had the right to distribute anti-war posters only if he wasn't creating a clear and present danger. And in that case, they said that Schenck's anti-war posters were actually creating the clear and present danger of harming the US effort during World War I. And so this was the issue that came about in 2020 and 2021, where you saw the anti-masking demonstrations. You're still seeing them, the anti-quarantine demonstration, anti-vaccination demonstrations. This is not a matter of protecting civil rights. This is a matter of protecting individual desires and individual interests. Okay, a couple of other things here you can think about in terms of the conflict over policy making. That is various kinds of things like the right to work versus right to income, privatized versus socialized or national healthcare systems. There's a thing called grassroots activism, which is when the people themselves come out and demonstrate in favor or against certain policies, versus something that's known as astroturfing, which is that when you get financial interests to pay people or support people doing protests of a cause that the financial interest actually supports. So something like the I don't know, say protests against guns, protests about gun control might be supported by financial interests, having one side or the other of that, and they would hire people to go out and to post stuff on the internet, on social media. They hire people to actually go to actual demonstrations and carry signs and things like that. Okay, I'm going to stop there. Thank you for coming today. Let me know if you have any questions or you want to talk about this further. I'll be available. I will not be having office hours during the Thanksgiving break, but I will be available by email if you want to contact me. I wish you all the best for everything. I wish you all the best with the rest of the semester and with your work. Again, let me know if you have any questions or let me know if I can help you with any kind of way. So take care. Good luck with everything.